William's powerful Welsh address paves the way for Catherine's big moment at the Christmas carol service. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Cardiff Castle as Prince William adjusted his tie for the third time. His reflection in the ornate mirror showed a man carrying the weight of tradition on his shoulders, yet there was something different about him today. The usual composed royal mask had given way to something more authentic, more vulnerable. Today, he would deliver what many would later call the most important speech of his life, though he didn't know it yet. Catherine watched from across their suite at the castle, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and concern. She had seen her husband prepare for countless public appearances, but this morning felt different. The way his fingers trembled slightly as he reviewed his notes, the way he kept glancing toward the window that overlooked the Welsh countryside they both had grown to love. She knew he was thinking about his grandmother, about his father, and about the enormous responsibility that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she had whispered to him the night before, her hand finding his in the darkness of their bedroom. But William had always been the type to shoulder burdens quietly, to internalize the pressure until it either broke him or forged him into something stronger. Today would determine which path he would take. The speech he was about to deliver wasn't just another royal engagement. It was a moment that had been building for months, perhaps years. The people of Wales had been watching, waiting, wondering if this young prince truly understood what it meant to serve them. His father had held the title of Prince of Wales for decades, but William's relationship with the principality had always been more complicated, more personal. He thought back to his university days at St. Andrews, when he was just William Wales, a young man trying to find his place in the world. Catherine had been there then, too, though neither of them could have imagined the journey that lay ahead. She had seen him at his most uncertain, had watched him struggle with the expectations that came with his birthright. Now, as he prepared to address the Welsh people, she could see that same uncertainty flickering behind his eyes. The speech had been months in the making. William had insisted on writing much of it himself, despite the palace communications team's offers to handle the heavy lifting. He had spent countless hours in his study, surrounded by books about Welsh history, culture, and the complex relationship between Wales and the Crown. Catherine had often found him there late at night, hunched over his desk, crossing out lines and starting again. "I want them to know I understand," he had told her during one of those late-night sessions. "Not just the political aspects, but what it means to be Welsh. What it means to have your identity, your language, your culture sometimes overlooked or misunderstood." Catherine had watched him struggle with this speech because she knew it represented something deeper than royal duty. It was William's attempt to bridge a gap that had existed for generations, to prove that he could be the Prince of Wales not just in title, but in spirit. The weight of that ambition was enormous, and she could see it wearing on him. The morning of the speech, their children had sensed the tension in the air. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been unusually quiet during breakfast, their eyes darting between their parents as if trying to decode the unspoken emotions swirling around the table. William had knelt down to their level before leaving, his voice gentle but serious as he explained that today was important, that sometimes grown-ups had to do things that scared them because they were the right things to do. Catherine had felt her throat tighten as she watched her husband with their children. This was the man the public rarely saw, not the future king, but the father who worried about setting the right example, who wanted his children to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. As William's car pulled away from the castle, Catherine found herself alone with thoughts that had been building for weeks. His success today would pave the way for her own moment in the spotlight, the Christmas carol service that had become so dear to her heart. For 3 years running, she had poured her soul into this event, transforming it from a simple royal obligation into something deeply meaningful, something that brought communities together and highlighted the quiet heroes who often went unnoticed. But this year felt different. This year, the service carried additional weight, additional scrutiny. The media had been watching every move, analyzing every decision, questioning whether the royal family was still relevant in modern Britain. William's speech today would either provide the foundation of public support she needed or create obstacles she would have to overcome. Catherine walked to the window and looked out over Cardiff, imagining her husband somewhere in the city, preparing to bare his soul to a nation. She thought about the conversations they had shared over the past few weeks, the late-night worries and early-morning planning sessions. They had always been a team, but recent months had tested that partnership in ways they hadn't expected. The pressure on William had been relentless. Critics questioned his commitment to his royal duties while he balanced his growing family responsibilities. The Welsh appointment had been particularly scrutinized, with some arguing that he lacked the deep connection to Wales that his father had cultivated over decades. Catherine had watched her husband absorb this criticism, internalize it, and, then, work tirelessly to prove the doubters wrong. She remembered the weekend they had spent in a small Welsh village, incognito as much as their security detail would allow. William had insisted on visiting local businesses, speaking with residents, trying to understand the real concerns of real people rather than the sanitized version usually presented during official visits. He had come home that evening energized but also sobered by what he had learned. They don't want grand gestures, he had told Catherine as they walked through their garden that evening. They want someone who genuinely cares about their daily struggles, their hopes for their children, their pride in their heritage. That realization had transformed his approach to the speech. Instead of focusing on policy or ceremonial language, he had decided to speak from the heart about what Wales meant to him personally, about the lessons he had learned from the Welsh people, and about his commitment to serving them not as a distant royal figure but as someone who genuinely understood their values and aspirations. Catherine had watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. She loved seeing her husband discover his authentic voice as a leader, but she also knew that authenticity came with risks. When you spoke from the heart, you exposed yourself to judgment not just of your words but of your character. The British public, and particularly the Welsh people, had become increasingly skeptical of polished royal performances. They wanted real emotion, real commitment, real understanding. As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself thinking about her own upcoming moment in the spotlight. The Christmas carol service had become deeply personal to her over the years. What had started as a traditional royal Christmas event had evolved into something that reflected her own values and passions, a celebration of community service, resilience, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This year's service would focus on the theme of love and empathy in action. Catherine had spent months selecting the performers, choosing readings, and, most importantly, deciding which unsung heroes to honor. She had wanted to highlight people who embodied the spirit of service that she believed was at the heart of modern monarchy, teachers who had gone above and beyond for their students, healthcare workers who had provided comfort in impossible circumstances, volunteers who had kept communities together during challenging times. But, as she planned the service, Catherine had been acutely aware that its success would depend partly on the foundation of public goodwill that William's speech today might create. The royal family's relationship with the British people had always been complex, built on a delicate balance of tradition and relevance, ceremony and authenticity. Recent years had brought new challenges to that balance, with younger generations particularly questioning the monarchy's place in contemporary society. Catherine understood that her Christmas carol service represented an opportunity to demonstrate the monarchy's continuing relevance, its ability to bring people together and celebrate the best of British society. But she also knew that such opportunities came with enormous pressure. One misstep, one moment of perceived insincerity or disconnect, could undermine months of careful preparation. She thought about the families who would attend the service, many of whom had experienced profound loss or hardship in recent years. These weren't celebrities or dignitaries seeking photo opportunities, they were real people who had earned their places through genuine service and sacrifice. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility to honor their stories properly, to create an event that would genuinely celebrate their contributions rather than simply provide a backdrop for royal pageantry. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her private secretary with an update on the final preparations for the carol service. As Catherine discussed seating arrangements and timing details, part of her mind remained with William, wondering how his speech was progressing, hoping that he was finding the words to convey everything that was in his heart. She knew that by evening, they would have a clearer picture of how the speech had been received. The media reaction would come first, followed by public opinion polls and social media sentiment analysis. But Catherine had learned over the years that the most important measure of success wasn't immediate public reaction but the longer-term impact on people's perceptions and feelings about the royal family's role in their lives. William's speech today wasn't just about Wales or his role as Prince of Wales. It was about establishing his credibility as a future king, demonstrating his ability to connect with people across the United Kingdom, and showing that he understood the evolving relationship between monarchy and democracy in the 21st century. Catherine knew that her own Christmas carol service would be viewed through a similar lens, as another data point in the ongoing assessment of their generation's fitness to lead. As afternoon approached, Catherine received word that William's speech had begun. She found herself unable to concentrate on anything else, her thoughts entirely focused on her husband and the moment that would define so much of what came next. She said a quiet prayer, not just for William's success, but for the wisdom to know how to build on whatever foundation his words might create. The weight of the crown had never felt more real than in these moments when everything seemed to hang in the balance, when personal authenticity met public expectation, when the future of an ancient institution rested on the words and actions of two people who had never asked for such responsibility but had accepted it nonetheless. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to imagine the faces in William's audience, the Welsh people who were hearing their future king speak directly to them about their shared future. She hoped they could see in him what she had always seen, a man of deep conviction and genuine care, someone who took his responsibilities seriously not because he had to, but because he truly wanted to serve. The ancient stones of the Welsh Assembly building seemed to hum with anticipation as Prince William approached the podium. The audience before him represented a cross-section of Welsh society, farmers from the valleys, teachers from Cardiff schools, small business owners from seaside towns, and university students whose futures would be shaped by the words he was about to speak. Their faces held a mixture of respect and skepticism, the look of people who had heard many promises from many politicians but were still willing to hope for something different. William's hands were steady now, though his heart continued to race. In the front row, he could see Megan Davies, an elderly woman from Snowdonia who had written to him months earlier about the challenges facing rural Welsh communities. Her letter had been unlike the formal correspondence he usually received, raw, honest, and filled with the kind of practical wisdom that only came from a lifetime of hard experience. She had become, in many ways, the voice he had tried to channel while writing this speech. Borda, he began, his pronunciation of the Welsh greeting careful but genuine. Good morning. I stand before you today not just as your Prince of Wales, but as someone who has been profoundly shaped by this land and its people. The words hung in the air for a moment, and William could feel the audience's attention sharpen. This wasn't the usual royal rhetoric of duty and service. There was something more personal in his tone, something that suggested this speech had cost him something to write. 3 years ago, William continued, my wife Catherine and I brought our children to a small village in Anglesey for what we thought would be a quiet weekend away from the pressures of public life. We ended up staying with a family whose sheep farm had been struggling for generations. The father, Gareth, worked 16-hour days trying to keep his land viable while his wife, Sarah, ran the village post office that served as the community's lifeline. William paused, remembering that weekend with vivid clarity. It had been Charlotte who had asked why Gareth looked so tired, and George who had wanted to know why the village didn't have the same shops as London. Those innocent questions had led to conversations that had fundamentally changed William's understanding of what it meant to serve Wales. That evening, after their children had gone to bed, Gareth and Sarah told us about the isolation many rural families face, about young people leaving for opportunities that don't exist in their communities, about the struggle to maintain Welsh language and traditions in a rapidly changing world. They didn't ask for grand solutions or royal interventions. They simply shared their reality with two people they thought might care enough to listen. In the audience, several heads nodded in recognition. These were stories every rural Welsh family knew, challenges every small community faced. But, hearing them acknowledged by their future king, spoken with genuine understanding rather than political sympathy, created a different kind of connection. William's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. That conversation changed something fundamental in how I understand my role as Prince of Wales. I realized that serving Wales isn't about preserving traditions like museum pieces or speaking Welsh at ceremonial events. It's about understanding that Welsh identity is alive, evolving, and deeply connected to practical realities that affect real families every day. He looked directly at Megan Davies as he spoke, remembering her letter's description of watching her grandchildren move away because there were no opportunities for them in the communities where their families had lived for centuries. Her eyes met his, and he saw something shift in her expression, not agreement, not yet, but recognition that he had at least begun to understand. Over the past 3 years, I have tried to learn what it truly means to be Welsh in the 21st century. I have sat in community meetings in the valleys where residents discussed how to keep their libraries open with volunteer help. I have visited schools in rural areas where teachers are fighting to keep Welsh language programs alive. I have walked through towns where high streets are struggling to survive while community groups work tirelessly to create new opportunities for young people. The speech had reached its emotional center, the place where William's personal journey intersected with his public role. Catherine had watched him struggle with this section for weeks, trying to find words that would convey his genuine evolution without sounding patronizing or presumptuous. What I have learned is that Wales doesn't need a prince who simply carries a title. Wales needs someone who understands that true leadership means listening more than speaking, serving more than being served, and recognizing that the strength of any community lies not in its buildings or institutions but in the connections between its people. A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The skeptical attention of the early minutes was transforming into something more engaged, more hopeful. People were leaning forward slightly, their faces showing the kind of interest that suggested William's words were finding their mark. I want to share with you a letter I received last month from a young woman named Saris, who grew up in a Welsh-speaking household in Carmarthenshire. She wrote, "Your Royal Highness, I don't need you to save Wales. Wales doesn't need saving. But I do need you to see Wales, really see it, with all its beauty and all its struggles, and to use your platform to help others see it too." William's voice cracked slightly on the word see, and, for a moment, his composure slipped. This wasn't calculated emotion or practiced vulnerability. This was a man genuinely moved by the responsibility that had been placed in his hands. Saris was right. My role is not to save or fix or change Wales according to some external vision. My role is to ensure that Wales is seen, heard, and valued not just within the United Kingdom but around the world. To amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. To create connections between communities that share similar challenges. To use whatever influence I have to open doors that might otherwise remain closed. In the back of the room, journalists were scribbling notes, recognizing that this speech was departing significantly from the usual royal template. Social media was already beginning to buzz with clips and quotes. But, in the front rows, ordinary Welsh citizens were having a different reaction. They were beginning to believe that their future king might actually understand what they needed from him. William moved toward his conclusion with growing confidence. In 2 weeks, my wife will host our annual Christmas carol service at Westminster Abbey. This year's service will celebrate the theme of love and empathy in action, honoring people who have made extraordinary contributions to their communities through ordinary acts of service. The mention of Catherine's carol service wasn't accidental. William was deliberately connecting his commitment to Wales with their broader approach to royal service, showing how local understanding informed national leadership. Among those being honored will be several people from Wales, teachers who have kept community schools thriving, healthcare workers who have provided comfort during the most difficult times, volunteers who have created opportunities where none existed before. These are the people who embody the Wales I have come to know and admire, not perfect, not without challenges, but resilient, compassionate, and deeply committed to each other. He paused again, looking around the room at faces that had grown increasingly attentive. Their stories will be shared not because Wales needs recognition from London, but because the rest of the United Kingdom needs to understand what Wales has to teach about community, resilience, and the kind of quiet heroism that sustains us all. The applause began slowly, starting with a few people in the middle rows and gradually spreading throughout the room. But this wasn't the polite, obligatory applause that usually greeted royal speeches. This was the kind of response that suggested people had been genuinely moved, genuinely convinced that they had heard something authentic and meaningful. As William acknowledged the applause, he caught sight of his protection officer discreetly checking his watch. The speech had run longer than planned, but no one seemed eager to leave. People were turning to each other, beginning conversations, sharing reactions. The formal distance that usually characterized royal events was dissolving into something more human, more connected. "Before I close," William said, raising his hand to quiet the applause, "I want to make you a promise. Not a political promise about policy or funding, but a personal promise about how I intend to serve as your Prince of Wales." The room fell completely silent. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the place where William would either solidify the connection he had been creating or lose it with words that rang false. I promise to continue learning. To continue listening. To continue showing up, not just for the ceremonies and celebrations, but for the ordinary moments when real life happens. I promise to use my voice to ensure that Wales is never an afterthought in national conversations, never treated as a footnote to larger stories. His voice grew stronger with each promise. I promise to raise my children to understand that their Welsh heritage is not a costume they put on for special occasions but a fundamental part of who they are. And I promise to work every day to earn the trust you have placed in me, knowing that titles mean nothing without the respect of the people you serve. The final applause was thunderous, sustained, and unmistakably genuine. People rose to their feet not because protocol demanded it but because they felt compelled to respond to something they had experienced as real and meaningful. William stood quietly for a moment, absorbing not just the applause but the feeling of having successfully bridged a gap he had been working to cross for years. As he stepped away from the podium, William felt a profound sense of relief mixed with anticipation. The speech had gone better than he had dared to hope, but he knew that its real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Would his words translate into lasting change in how Wales viewed the monarchy? Would they provide the foundation Catherine needed for her own moment in the spotlight? But, for now, in this moment, surrounded by the energy of people who seemed genuinely inspired by what they had heard, William allowed himself to feel something he rarely experienced in his public role, the satisfaction of knowing he had spoken truthfully, authentically, and effectively about something that mattered deeply to him. The ancient stones of the Welsh Assembly building had witnessed many speeches over the years, but few that had created the kind of emotional resonance that still hung in the air as people slowly began to file out, their conversations animated, their faces bright with the possibility that something important had just happened. The car ride back to Cardiff Castle passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the soft murmur of William's private secretary fielding phone calls from palace officials and media representatives. William stared out the window at the Welsh countryside, his mind still processing what had just occurred. The speech had felt different while he was delivering it, more connected, more authentic than any public address he had ever given. But the real question was whether that feeling had translated to his audience and, more importantly, whether it would resonate beyond the walls of the Assembly building. His phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine, watching the live stream. "I'm so proud of you. You found your voice today." The simple message sent a wave of warmth through him. Catherine understood better than anyone what this speech had cost him, how much courage it had taken to abandon the safe language of royal protocol and speak from his heart about things that mattered to him personally. As they approached the castle, William could see small groups of people gathered along the streets, many holding Welsh flags or homemade signs. Word of the speech was already spreading, and the crowd seemed different from the usual royal watchers. There was an energy here that felt more engaged, more hopeful than the polite curiosity that typically greeted royal visits. One sign caught his attention: Diolch am wrando, thank you for listening. The simple Welsh phrase captured something essential about what had happened today. For too long, the relationship between Wales and the Crown had felt like a one-way conversation, with royal figures speaking to Wales rather than with Wales. Today, for perhaps the first time, William had demonstrated that he was genuinely listening to what Welsh people were saying about their lives, their concerns, and their hopes for the future. Back at the castle, Catherine was waiting in their private sitting room, her laptop open to various news websites and social media feeds. She looked up as William entered, her face showing a mixture of excitement and relief that made his heart skip a beat. "The reaction is extraordinary," she said, rising to embrace him. "Look at this." She guided him to the laptop screen, which showed a Twitter feed full of positive responses to the speech. But these weren't the usual royal watchers or professional commentators. These were ordinary Welsh people sharing their thoughts in real time, many of them expressing surprise at how moved they had been by William's words. "This one particularly struck me," Catherine said, pointing to a tweet from a teacher in the Valleys. "Never thought I'd say this about a royal speech, but Prince William gets it. He actually understands what we're dealing with out here. Maybe there's hope for the monarchy after all." William read over similar messages, each one reinforcing the sense that something significant had shifted today. These weren't people predisposed to support the royal family, these were skeptics who had been won over by the authenticity they had heard in his words. The Welsh language media is particularly positive, Catherine continued, showing him several articles that had already been published online. They're saying this is the first time they've felt like a member of the royal family truly understood the importance of Welsh culture and identity in the modern context. William sank into the chair beside her, feeling the adrenaline of the morning beginning to fade into something deeper and more reflective. I kept thinking about that conversation we had last month, he said, when you asked me what kind of king I wanted to be. Today felt like the first time I'd been able to show people an authentic glimpse of that. Catherine nodded, remembering that late-night conversation when William had struggled to articulate his vision for modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its essential character. You found a way to be both personal and professional, both vulnerable and strong. That's not easy to achieve. The phone rang, interrupting their moment of quiet reflection. It was William's father, King Charles, calling to offer his congratulations on the speech. The conversation was brief but warm, with Charles expressing genuine pride in how William had handled such a challenging moment. When William hung up, he felt a sense of completion, as if something that had been building for months had finally found its proper resolution. Now comes the real test, William said, looking at Catherine with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Your carol service is in 2 weeks. The foundation is there, but you'll need to build on it in a way that shows continuity between what I said today and the broader vision we have for our role. Catherine had been thinking about exactly this challenge since watching William's speech. The Christmas carol service had always been her signature event, but this year it carried additional weight. It would be the first major royal event following William's Welsh address, and many would view it as a test of whether their generation of royals could consistently deliver the kind of authentic, meaningful public service they had promised. I've been thinking about the theme, Catherine said. Love and empathy in action. It ties directly into what you said today about real leadership being about serving rather than being served. But I want to make sure the people we honor at the service reflect that same understanding of community and service that you talked about in Wales. She opened another folder on her laptop, this one containing profiles of the people who would be recognized at the carol service. Look at this woman, Mary Jenkins from Merthyr Tydfil. She's been running a community food bank for 5 years, but she also teaches Welsh language classes for elderly residents who never had the chance to learn as children. She embodies exactly what you were talking about, someone who sees community service not as charity but as connection. William studied Mary's profile, recognizing the kind of person he had met countless times during his travels through Wales. She should definitely be featured prominently. People need to see that we're not just paying lip service to these values, we're actively celebrating people who live them every day. Catherine had spent weeks carefully curating the guest list for the carol service, trying to balance the traditional elements that people expected with the kind of authentic community representation that would give substance to the event's themes. It was a delicate balance, requiring her to navigate between the expectations of palace protocol and her own vision for what royal events could become. The music selections are also crucial, she continued, showing William another document. I want to include traditional Welsh hymns alongside the English carols, performed by the same community choir that sang at your event today. It creates a direct connection between your speech and the service, showing that what you said about Welsh culture being valued and celebrated wasn't just words. William could see how carefully Catherine had thought through every element of the service. This wasn't just event planning, it was strategic communication designed to reinforce the messages he had delivered while expanding them to encompass their broader approach to royal service. What about the readings? William asked, knowing that Catherine had always paid particular attention to the spoken word elements of the service. I've asked several of the community heroes we're honoring to do readings, she replied. Not just about Christmas or faith, but about service, community, and the kind of love that shows itself through action rather than words. Mary Jenkins, for instance, will read a passage about hospitality and welcoming strangers. The strategy was becoming clear. Rather than treating the carol service as a separate event, Catherine was creating it as a continuation of the conversation William had started in Wales. The Welsh address would establish the principles, the carol service would demonstrate those principles in action through the people who would be celebrated and the stories that would be told. "There's one more element I want to discuss with you," Catherine said, her tone becoming more serious. "I've been invited to do several interviews in the lead-up to the service, BBC, ITV, some of the Welsh language media. Usually, I would do 1 or 2 formal interviews and leave it at that. But, given the response to your speech today, I'm wondering if I should be more available, more willing to engage directly with questions about our approach to royal service." William considered this carefully. Media strategy had always been a source of tension for them, balancing the need for public engagement with their desire for privacy and authenticity. But, the success of today's speech suggested that authenticity, even when it involved taking risks, might be more effective than the traditional royal approach of carefully controlled messaging. "What kind of questions are you expecting?" he asked. "The obvious ones about the monarchy's relevance, about whether we understand the challenges ordinary families are facing, about how we're different from previous generations of royals," Catherine replied. "But, also more specific questions about the carol service, about why we've chosen to honor the people we have, about what we hope to achieve beyond just hosting a nice Christmas event." William nodded, recognizing these as the kinds of questions that could either reinforce the positive momentum from his speech or undermine it if not handled carefully. "I think you should do them," he said after a moment. "Today showed me that people respond to authenticity, even when it's uncomfortable or risky. The interviews will give you a chance to explain your own vision for royal service in the same direct way I was able to do today." Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of such extensive media exposure, but also a sense of excitement. For too long, she had felt constrained by the traditional royal approach to public communication, measured, careful, and often so diplomatic as to be meaningless. William's success today suggested there might be another way, one that honored their responsibilities while allowing them to speak more directly about their values and commitments. "The children have been asking about the carol service," William said, changing the subject slightly. "George particularly wants to know if he can meet some of the people we're honoring. I think there's something powerful about letting our children see examples of service in action, not just hearing about it in abstract terms." Catherine smiled, remembering George's intense curiosity about the people they met during official engagements. "That's actually perfect. Several of the honorees have children around George and Charlotte's ages. It would be natural for them to interact, and it would show the family dimension of service, how values get passed from one generation to the next." As evening approached, William and Catherine continued planning the details of the carol service, but their conversation kept returning to the larger questions raised by the day's events. They both sensed that something important had shifted in their relationship with the public, that William's speech had opened a door to a different kind of royal engagement. The question now was whether they could walk through that door consistently, authentically, and effectively. "Whatever happens with the carol service," William said as they finally closed the laptop and prepared for dinner, "today felt like a beginning rather than an ending. For the first time since we married, I feel like I have a clear sense of what kind of future king I want to be and how to get there." Catherine took his hand, feeling the truth of his words and the responsibility they implied. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to either build on today's success or squander it through complacency or missteps. But tonight, they could allow themselves to feel hopeful about the future they were building together, one authentic moment at a time. The morning of Catherine's first major interview following William's Welsh speech dawned crisp and clear at Windsor Castle. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the sapphire necklace that had belonged to William's mother. The choice of jewelry wasn't accidental. Today she needed every bit of strength and connection to the legacy she was helping to shape. 2 weeks had passed since William's address in Wales, and the response had exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Social media continued to buzz with positive commentary from Welsh communities, newspaper editorials praised his authentic approach to royal service, and, most importantly, polling showed a significant uptick in approval ratings not just for William but for the royal family as a whole. But Catherine knew that public opinion was fragile, particularly when it came to the monarchy. One misstep, one moment of perceived insincerity or disconnect, could unravel weeks of positive momentum. Today's interview with the BBC would either reinforce the foundation William had built or reveal cracks that critics could exploit. "Mummy, why do you look nervous?" Charlotte asked from the doorway, her 8-year-old intuition picking up on the tension Catherine was trying to hide. Catherine knelt down to Charlotte's level, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes grown-ups have important conversations that might help other people, but they can feel a bit scary because we want to make sure we say the right things. Charlotte nodded solemnly, then wrapped her arms around her mother's neck. You always say the right things to us. Just pretend you're talking to me and George and Louis. The simple wisdom of her daughter's words hit Catherine with unexpected force. All her anxiety about royal protocol, about political implications, about media strategy, none of that mattered as much as speaking truthfully about what she believed and why she cared about the work she was doing. William appeared in the doorway, having overheard Charlotte's comment. Out of the mouths of babes, he said, his smile mixing pride and affection. She's right, you know. The reason your carol service means so much to people is because it feels personal, like an extension of who you are rather than something you're doing because it's expected. Catherine stood, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. The interview is in an hour. Any last-minute advice from my political strategist husband? Don't have a political strategist husband today, William replied, kissing her forehead. Just be the woman who stays up late reading nomination letters for community heroes because she genuinely cares about their stories. That's who people need to meet. An hour later, Catherine sat across from veteran BBC presenter Hugh Edwards in the castle's green drawing room. The setting had been chosen to project both intimacy and grandeur, formal enough to respect the gravity of her position, but warm enough to encourage the kind of honest conversation that had made William's Welsh speech so effective. Your Royal Highness, thank you for joining us today, Edwards began, his tone respectful but direct. Your